Welcome back to Smarter Markets at IETA's North America Climate Summit 2024. I'm joined by Steve Zwick, producer and host of Bionic Planet. Good to see you, Steve.
Yeah, great to see you again.
And I wanted to ask you, it's a great conference so far, and I was curious, what made you want to attend next this year?
Well, the same thing that's driven me over the past few years, which is that I feel like we still have this huge disconnect between the reality of what's happening here, what's happening in the COP, and public discourse, how it's perceived out there, how it's discussed out there. And I'm still really concerned that people here are moving along. They're trying to address really complicated issues in a way that is scientifically sound, and they continue to think that if they just keep moving forward, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, adapting as they go along, everything is going to be fine. And I'm still concerned that they're going to get torpedoed if they don't pay attention to how things are perceived outside this arena.
And how do you think things are being perceived right now, or what's the risk?
I think the perception is that the markets were a big mistake. This is when you talk to people out there. There's a perception that the voluntary carbon market, especially, just emerged one day, was concocted by the oil industry to avoid taking action, and that people woke up and realized, oh, it's a disaster. It's shake and bake. It's smoke and mirrors. And now let's bring some meat into it. That's the perception, is that it was broken and now it's being fixed. Whereas the reality is that if you go back to 20 years ago, especially in red, avoided deforestation, going back to the very start, the idea was, okay, you've got all this modeling that was done. The IPCC evaluated it. The whole discussion was we know what seems to work. We also know we don't have enough data. We know we need more data to really make it rock solid, but we have enough. How can we create a system that will take what we have, give us a reasonable expectation of success, and then adapt over time? And embedded in that was a reevaluation after 10 years. Embedded in that was also the idea that you're going to have conservative baselining, and that you're going to ignore potential positive externalities, which are things that they didn't even try to quantify. And now, as we're coming, and as the data was becoming available and people were realizing this works, this doesn't, certain people, as we know, took what didn't work out of context and made it look like the whole thing was a sham, which it was not. It never was. It was the voluntary market. Really, it's voluntary. It's not meant to carry the whole load. It's meant to just give us that, take us above and beyond what's required by law, and to test new methodologies, and it succeeded in both of those. And I feel like now, with this narrative out there that, okay, they started wrong and now they're on the right track, the same thing is going to happen, because we're still moving towards, yes, you've got some methodologies where the data is there, it's going to be more solid, but you've got other elements of the voluntary market that are still going to have uncertainties and still need to be funded. And I feel like, there are going to be imperfections, and unless the market makes it clear to people that there is still an experiment, the entire climate challenge is a learn by doing exercise. It's going to be, ideologues are going to still come in at some point and cherry pick and make it look like the whole thing is what they said it was before, which it wasn't.
And it often seems like we're in this situation where the perfect is the enemy of the good. Mm-hmm. And markets are by their nature experimental. This is certainly a big experiment, and starting off, as you said, learning by doing. But it seems like that's a big mindset shift that's required. That it's not, we're going to get it all right and then we're going to execute, but we're going to figure it out as we go, and we need to get going because it's an important problem. How do you think you shift that mindset?
I think part of it, there's two components there. Some elements are more solid than others, and I think that maybe that it's time we should go back to trying to bring more compliance elements into this. If you're doing a compliance market, then you should have that kind of certainty. But I also think we just need to emphasize that it's the way everything works. This market is being held to a degree of certainty that nothing is. And I don't really know any other sector that's it's the most difficult sector, because you've got social sciences layered on top of physical sciences, and they all have their, so I think we just, to answer the question, because I'm about to go off on a tangent on why it is, but I think we just need to educate people. I think we just need to make it clear that there are elements of uncertainty. I did an episode on uncertainty, and I got wonderful feedback from the scientific community. I didn't get much good feedback from people inside here because I think they're afraid to talk about it. People are afraid to talk about uncertainty. They're afraid that it's going to leave them vulnerable, whereas I think if you don't talk about it, you're vulnerable.
And what do you think drives that fear?
Well, part of it is past experience, because there's a little bit of a bunker mentality, because they have had things. They know it's not perfect, and they've had things taken out of context. They've been torpedoed. I think another element is it just seems to be the nature of this sector not to talk about that. It's a communications philosophy that I think has crippled this sector. And this is, I came into this from mainstream media. I came in 2005, and going into every other sector I'd parachuted into before, where there was the auto industry, where there was covering defense or whatever. There were always people willing to sit there and talk to you about things in all of its complexity. And this one, I felt from the very start, people were unwilling to, and then the only people who were willing to were the people who were trying to pick it apart. So I think that is kind of a thing that scientists tend to have, in that they when they talk among themselves, they talk about uncertainty. When they talk to the general public, they talk they don't like to talk at all, really, because they're afraid it's going to go someplace. And I think the other one just it is, they know that it's not easy. I think that's, if I can rephrase what I just said, because I feel this too. When you hear something that's wrong and you know it's wrong, but you know that to explain that, like if somebody says something about one person in a community who had a bad experience with a project, well, that may be a true story, but then you know that this person was in the minority, and then to explain, and to explain why that fact may be irrelevant, you've got to go back and explain how the process works, every step that leads up to it. And it's just such a big thing to talk about. I think it just turns people off.
And you've been, doing this a long time, as you said. Have you found certain ways to communicate that gets through to people who might come at it with a different point of view?
I think I have, yeah. I think it's also learned by doing. But one is to think in a phased approach. Try to think of what specific element you're trying to communicate, and what are the prerequisites for making it clear to someone. If you're talking about, an example might be an indigenous-led carbon project. Think of it. Okay, you're in stories I did on the first indigenous project, going back Elmir Sudiri. I didn't sit there and start with the technicalities. I started by telling his personal story, which was, here's an indigenous leader who's living in an area that is facing tremendous amounts of degradation, and he wants to save the forest, but he knows that part of his community, his community is basically divided into three parts, just like any society. There are those who want to chop the forest, there are those who want to save it, then there are those in the middle who vacillate between the two, and he knew he had to win over the middle in order to get the red project through. So here's a guy who you can really identify with. Then what are the clear objectives he faces? Well, the threat to the forest is coming from illegal loggers coming in, paying bribes to people along a certain part. They're bringing in benefits that they will lose if they don't engage in the illegal logging. He had to find a way to persuade people to stop logging, to compensate them for not doing so, and then also to transition his community into a new kind of hybrid economy that was both an indigenous economy and an economy that's tethered with ours. And he used carbon finance to do that. That might not be the best example, because that project did end up going sideways eventually, but the communication out of the story is universal. The same thing is happening in projects in Kenya that I know of, and in other projects in Brazil, in Peru, finding the specific person who is facing the challenge, and then not just telling their story in a light, fluffy way about, look at this person facing the challenge, but think of it like a mystery. And the tools that we're trying to explain have to be the components of that mystery, if that makes sense. So an analogy I like to use is that film Ocean's 11, or any heist movie. Those are complicated films, but they're entertaining, even though they bring lots of complexity, because you do have a clear objective, and you have all these goofy things that get in the way, and people will follow that along. So I think using story structure is an effective way, and also just remembering what the prerequisites are, because that is. I was talking to a guy yesterday, a former colleague of mine from my days at Vera, and he told me about a paper that, and I've drawn a blank on the name of it. But the idea is you breaking complex issues down into 4 quadrants, starting with you've got a vague idea, and then you've got the detailed specific, and then you have to bring people sequentially from an idea to a concept, I forget the next quadrant, and then eventually to the specific. And that's universal. It's pedagogy. It's how you teach kids to read. It's how you teach. It's how we all learn. And, any kindergarten teacher knows this stuff, and we need to think like kindergarten teachers.
That's great. And before I let you go, I wanted to ask you, because you started the conversation saying that if we don't learn how to tell this complex story in a better, more convincing way, the markets are setting themselves up to be torpedoed again. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the issue that could be the next big risk for getting torpedoed? And if we tell the story right, what's the opportunity?
Well, there is a difference between themes and stories. Stories to me are what I just described: a specific person trying to, someone trying to achieve an objective and facing obstacles and being wrong and learning as they go. And then there are themes, and I think they're both different ways of reaching a different audience. We need them both. And one big theme is this theme of uncertainty, because everything we deal with in life is we're constantly making decisions based on imperfect information. And you can make the right decision and suffer a bad consequence, and you can make a wrong decision and get lucky. But it's how are you making the right decisions over time based on the information you have, and how are you dealing with uncertainty? And I think I've just found when I talk to people about uncertainty in the markets, using an example like a batting average in baseball. If someone's a baseball fan, the best hitters in the world bat 400, but that means they're out 6 out of 4 times. But we still consider them the best, and we know that consistency is what we're looking for. And in these markets, it's the same thing. We're dealing with models, we're dealing with uncertainty, but we are adapting over time. And as we get more data, we become more and more certain, more and more precise. People do get that. I found when I was working with Vera for a little bit there, talking to reporters, most reporters, when you talk to them about the challenges that we face, and that it is about uncertainty, that it is about constantly learning lessons, applying those lessons as we go, they get it. So I think a big part of it is just being willing to talk about that in an adult way and not shy away from it. Because I just find way too many people think, one of the conversations that keeps coming up here is people have been rightly finally saying, well, we need to talk about the benefits. They're going to talk about community benefits and everything. And that's important, but you need to talk about how those benefits translate into climate benefits, how reducing poverty reduces deforestation. You need to show that these projects, even though there is uncertainty over the degree of an impact, over the quantification of an impact, we can clearly see that the impact is happening. And something that I'm sure David Antonioli, I know that he was in here, something he's been talking about a lot, and this also resonates well with people, is these are transitional mechanisms. So the specific little details of what's accomplished right now is secondary to the much bigger implications of what happens 20, 30 years down the road. If you can take an indigenous community that's on the brink of losing their forest, and you can reduce you can help them reduce deforestation and change their indigenous economy into something more sustainable, the benefits are multiple of anything that we look at now. And that ratio, because again, the big study from 2019 was showing that for every forest, the emissions from every hectare of forest lost now, it'll take 50 years of regrowth to recapture that, or we have to replant 50 times as much. And we're losing millions of hectares a year, and we're planting tens of thousands. And the impactful benefits, the fact that the multipliers are so big relative to the uncertainty is not that sophisticated. I mean, this isn't a very complicated thing, and for some reason we're afraid of it. So I think that is another thing to emphasize. Did that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks so much for coming by, Steve.
All right,
Really
thanks.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
All right.
All right. Did that